In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace both engine mounts on a 1983 Alfa Romeo Spider. This will work for all Series 3 Spiders and can apply to other series as well. A common indication of bad motor mounts is that the engine will rock on startup and when you get on the gas, as shown in this video here. Stick with me, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to replace both of the motor mounts on your car without taking the motor out. I use simple tools like jacks, ramps, and wood blocks, and of course, some elbow grease. In order to access the engine mounts on these cars, you have to go underneath the airbox a little bit. Right down there in that crevice underneath the exhaust plenum, you can see, or the exhaust manifold, you can see that engine mount way down there, if my camera will focus. And there's one on the other side as well, which is much more difficult to see from the top of the car, if at all. I promise I'll get you a view of that later, but for now, take off your intake, starting with the upper crossover tube, disconnect the mass airflow sensor, get the air filter out of there, and then get the lower portion of the box out with a 13mm wrench. You're also going to want to loosen and remove your fan shroud from your radiator. Then go to the underside of the car and remove your oil pan guard if you have one. It's 4 13mm bolts. Then I'm going to take a rag and just clean off any of the excess dirt because you're going to be under the car for a while. Once you've done that, you can take a block of wood that reaches both sides of the oil pan and jack it up using a floor jack. This will give you some more room to work with, and it will decompress the motor mount enough to get it off the car. All of the hardware is 13mm. There are 3 nuts holding the mount to the engine itself, and there are 2 studs that hold the engine mount to the... Most of the hardware will be accessible from the top of the mount, but the lower stud and the rearmost nut should be taken off from the underside of the car. I'm going to play this in real time just because it's important for you to see how the engine moves up. I ended up taking off the 2 bolts that hold the rubber onto the metal piece of the original motor mount. You can do this, but you don't have to. I'm doing it just to get it out of the way. Loosening the passenger side motor mount before doing this might have been a good idea just to get a little more room out of the engine, but it worked for me and it can work for you too.
Yeah, I think that was time for a new motor mount. So this is the old motor mount. This is the new motor mount. You can see how much compression that's under, even when it's not on the car.
So I cleaned up a little bit of the grease and it's time to put the new motor mount in. Gonna have to jack up the engine even further because it's more extended. This took me about 5 or 10 minutes just because I wanted to make sure it was fit perfect. I had all the hardware on there a little bit loosely and I could get it into a secure and safe spot before lowering the engine back down. That's super important. Don't want to crush anything, don't want to break anything. So here it is, final little fitment. I have all of the bolts where I want them to, and then I went ahead and I reattached all the hardware. Well, 1 out of 2 of the motor mounts are done, but we're not necessarily halfway finished. The passenger side is notoriously difficult because of a bracket that runs between the engine mount and the intake plenum. It's why I wanted to make this video because it's very difficult to remove. First, get the coolant tank out of the way so you have more room to look into the motor mount and into the intake bracket.
I am underneath the car looking at it from upside down, and you can see the intake bracket going from the motor mount up and then over towards the plenum. This 17 right here, that is a real pain in the
Alpha.
It took PB Blaster and going back and forth and forward and reverse with my impact gun on high to finally get that thing to start. I held the gun on there for probably a good 2 or 3 minutes total for it to actually come off. So the nut on the other side came off real easily, and that's now loose as well.
One thing I forgot to mention that might happen to you as well is that the bolt spins but doesn't back out. That's because it's flat in the middle, not threaded. The bracket doesn't have threads on the inside, so you're going to need to PB blast it again.
So here's the bolt, and as you can see, it's super corroded, all worn out. And if you look closely, you can see that it's expanded where it was sitting inside of the bracket, which made it very difficult to get out.
Now that all the hardware is off, I'm using a 4x4 piece of wood to bias the engine up on one side to give me enough room to get the mount and the bracket out all in one piece.
This is the full passenger side motor mount, and it sits in the car like so. The bracket that's been giving me a pain is nice and wedged in there. As you can see, it's off center a little bit. That's probably from moving it and getting it out, and it's possible to take just the rubber piece off, but since I have all the pieces and this looks like it needs, some TLC, a good paint job maybe, I'm gonna try and get that all done today. So as you can see, on the inside, it is very, very corroded, and the outside's got, it's not terrible, but could use a paint job.
Here's a little side-by-side with the old mount on the right and the new mount on the left. The new mount is definitely a lot straighter and less compressed than the old mount, as is expected. Now it's time to clean everything up. What you're going to need is a drill, a wire wheel, and some glasses. And you're also going to want a mask. And I'm not just talking about an N95, I'm talking about a respirator. You're working with rust, you don't want that stuff getting in your lungs. I'm satisfied with that result. There's a bit of pitting, a bit of scoring. I can't get the inside, but that's okay. I'm done for now. It's time to go and move on to the pan guard. Using the same process, wire wheel, with a respirator, of course, and glasses. Gonna wire wheel off all the rust and then shoot it with a little bit of clear. I like the stainless steel look that it brings to the bottom of the engine. It matches with the oil pan nicely, and I just want to preserve that. It's gonna get beat up, so painting it doesn't really make sense, and once I'm done with this, I can go get some new hardware.
And for those that want to know, the thread pitch and the size of the 17mm bolt that runs through is M10 by 1.5. So if you can find a bolt like that that's got a 17mm head and a nut to fit it, then you can replace it with OEM stuff. But here in the States, I decided to go with a 2-inch by 3/8 of an inch ACD sync bolt. Here we have all of our hardware necessary to attach the motor mount and the bracket back to the car, excluding a few 13mm bolts and nuts, which go on the insides of the mount itself. We have our bolt, which threads through both the mount and the bracket. Two 17mm bolts, which mount into the intake plenum and fuel system. A 10mm bolt, which goes to the inside of the bracket and holds the fuel rail in place. And finally, a 13mm bolt, which secures the bracket to the intake at its final position. All of this will go on the car as I just described it, and then everything will get tightened down all at once so that it's nice and even.
For those looking for more information on that bracket, there are a few images floating around on the internet of it, and they all come from the Alfa Romeo owners and repair manuals. I didn't want to put those in the video for risk of copyright infringement, so if you have any more questions, I would suggest looking on AlfaBB.com. It's a bulletin board and it helps.
So I now have the new engine mount on the car. Nothing is tightened down, obviously, but one of the good things is when you have the engine up like this, it's much easier to get this bracket back into place. Before I finish up, just wanted to point out that hole right there. That's where the new bolt will be going through. And then nice view from underneath, you can see the 17mm holding the bracket in place. Right there is where the 10mm will go, and way up there is where that 13 goes and attaches to the plenum.
Well, congratulations. You finished replacing both your motor mounts. Put back your coolant bottle, the fan shroud, intake, and oil pan guard, and then take your car for a nice long drive. You might notice better throttle response, less rocking or shaking while driving, and better shifting. You'll enjoy these benefits for a long time. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you later.